joining me from the nation's capital, where it's about to enjoy another swampy Capitol 4th. I remember when I was a White House intern back in 1997, and those exciting days. Anyway, I digress. Is Rick Klein. He is the Washington bureau chief of ABC News. I can now say he's a veteran political correspondent. Prior to that, he was political director of ABC News. In a past life, he was at the Boston Globe. And of course, more than anything else, he covered himself in glory as the boss man at the Daily Princetonian in the late 1990s. Did I cover it all, sir?
It did, but Robin, you didn't tell me you'd be wearing this Dodgers shirt. That's a microaggression as far as I'm concerned.
I do it just to get under the skin of. Are you a Yankees fan?
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. But I will get into baseball. It's just a reminder to, explain how dynamic you are. No microaggression intended, believe me. But I actually want to talk about what's being debated right now. As we tape this on Wednesday, July 2nd, the House is trying to reconcile what the Senate barely passed down in this big, beautiful bill, which had so many moving parts. And in reconciliation, if it was so difficult to pass through to the upper chamber to begin with, how do they whip that discipline in shape? I think it falls back to the House Speaker now. Explain some of the moving parts that you're hearing about.
I got a really short answer for you. Donald Trump. He's the through line, and he is what muscled it past the House the first time. He is what got it through the Senate. And if this ends up becoming law, it'll be because of him and because of the way that he's been able to change the face of the Republican Party and to remake it in his likeness. And it is an astounding feat because you've got these disparate factions and these very closely divided Senate and a very closely divided House. You've got moderates who think this is too draconian. You have conservatives who are insisting this doesn't go nearly far enough in terms of budget cuts, and they're worried about debt and spending that's going to go on for decades and decades. And Donald Trump has basically been able to tell Congress, tune it all out, just get a bill to my desk. And, our reporters have been running around Capitol Hill asking members of Congress, why are you standing in the president's way? And they're even saying, well, we're not really sure what the president wants. Does he want the House bill? Does he want the Senate bill? What does he want in? What does he want out? I don't get the sense that the White House is really sweating the details. They want a bill. He's labeled it, as you said, the big, beautiful bill. He wants it on his desk. He's long said he wanted it before the 4th of July. And here we are on the eve, and he's got a chance at that. I
wonder how much profanity there is, behind the scenes on these golf course trips with him, these famous things. Or when he gets on the phone, does he channel Roy Cohn? Does he say, look, vote against it, I'll primary you, I have no problem? There's no nuance to it in the past where, I will have your constituents call you and complain and clog up the White House phone banks. No, it's pretty direct. If you don't, then you're out.
Yeah, and I'm not privy to all those conversations, but from what I know of the president's personal private lobbying, it actually doesn't include a lot of threats. The threats are more on social media. The threats are on Truth Social. The threats might come before a camera. But when he's talking individually, he's often turning on the charm offensive. He wants you on the side. He wants you to get this done. And why wouldn't you do this? And, I don't think it's about angry outbursts or, threats that happen verbally. I think that he saves that for somewhere else and tries to shower someone with love and with attention along the way. So,
there's that cudgel of the feared MAGA primary, which it's something no one looks forward to re-election and the campaign and the perpetual campaign and the fundraising, but that kind of pummeling by itself, oftentimes, as we saw in Georgia, it didn't help people. As we saw, was it in Wisconsin? I'm trying to jog my memory. You're not strengthened for the general against the Democrat. And so there's this terror. Why not avoid it altogether?
There's times where he's gotten involved and it's blown up in the Republican Party's face. You mentioned Georgia, also Alabama. We remember that early in his first term. The Wisconsin Senate race. There is there's another factor in this right now, which is Elon Musk. And that puts a different wrinkle onto this, the idea of what a MAGA primary might look like. Musk is saying publicly that he's inclined to support people that oppose this bill and might support them in primaries. And we've talked to members of Congress who are kind of expecting that sort of backup, expecting that Musk will make good on that. He's even talking about starting his own political party. Whether that happens or not, the idea of Musk and Trump together, that was a juggernaut. That was a feared entity. And going into the midterms next year, there weren't many Republicans who wanted to be on the wrong side of that, or many Democrats either. Fast forward to this year, they worked together on that Wisconsin Supreme Court race. It ended up the Musk effect was a kind of a negative for the conservative candidate in that race. And that mixed the politics. And then Musk had the very public breakdown with Trump that was on pause for a few weeks. It got restarted in the last couple of days, and now Trump threatening to put Doge, his own agency, back on Musk himself. So whether Musk backs down or not, there is a different wrinkle now that I think makes it a little harder to pass, even to get Republicans on board. Because I'll tell you, there's a lot of conservative Republicans who are uneasy about this bill. They don't really love this thing. They're worried about its political consequences. They're also worried about the policy consequences. They're worried about the idea that you're taking the debt ceiling off the table and you're adding trillions to the national debt. And if the White House projections don't come through, then you're talking about very, very severe increases in spending, coupled with cuts to Medicaid that will result in people losing access. And so the politics become very complicated. But that Musk effect, at least for now, is a little different.
Rick, tease this out for me. I'm quoting from the Wall Street Journal today, this great article I sent you. Quote, to understand why Republicans have struggled to unite behind their domestic policy bill that cuts taxes and Medicaid, look at how much progress the party has made on one of its other primary goals, winning support from working class Americans. About 15 years ago, in 2009, Republicans represented 26 of the 100 lowest income House districts, according to census data. By 2023, they represented 56, more than half. At the same time, Democrats came to dominate the wealthiest House districts, representing 69 of the 100th, where incomes are highest. And I thought of you immediately about this, and I actually thought, am I the only one out there that ponders that 2012 postmortem after Mitt Romney lost? And the Republican Party saying, we really have to go back and figure out an immigration strategy. We have to broaden our tent. There was no real rational argument that if you go for the populist bases, if you throw out the red meat, if you double down on, I don't know, anger, is it madness, is it vindication? It's a whole left behind generation in the wake of subprime, that you can actually corner the Senate and the Electoral College. And he's now done this twice, and he's on the verge of pushing through major kind of generational tax plans.
Yeah, and Roben, you mentioned that post-2012 period, all the way through the 2016 campaign, he was the only one on that populist side of things. That 15, 16 candidates, he was talking about things and in ways that other Republicans thought, frankly, at the time were silly, and often sounded more like Bernie Sanders than, say, Jeb Bush or Mitt Romney. And there has been kind of an upending of the political coalitions, and it is driven by Donald Trump. And those are really striking statistics. It's a really interesting read in the journal that you referenced. I encourage anyone to digest what its meaning is. And there's an element in this bill that's getting a little less attention than other aspects of it. But there's something there that I think Democrats are actually quite jealous they didn't think of it or try to pass on their own. The no tax on tips. That's something Donald Trump promised as a candidate.
He worked in Nevada out west super well. Yeah.
He said it, thinking about Las Vegas and about wage workers there. And, this is something that, this is any party of the working class would love to be on the side of that to not tax tips up to a certain amount and under certain circumstances. And Donald Trump took that issue away and included in this bill. That is something that a Mitt Romney tax bill or a Jeb Bush tax bill never would have included. It's really hard to imagine that your father's Republican Party going back 15 years only would have thought about things like that. That would have been a Democratic amendment to a Republican bill that all the Republicans would probably vote down. But it is something that Republicans have come to embrace right now. And I think when they sell this, assuming this becomes law, when they sell this to the public, you're going to hear a lot more about that because it's so key to holding together that working class coalition and, papering over or kind of putting to the side the impacts on Medicaid, because
explain that to me. So many of these deep red states that rejected the expansion of Medicaid, these are precisely in the zones right now that are seeing the rural hospital crisis, the OBGYN crisis. They need telemedicine more than anything else. How is it not apparent to all these voters and actually their senators and governors that cuts to Medicaid would drastically hurt these states? I mean, it's not another thing where if you're giving block grants to more blue states, well, they'll figure out a way to make up the difference. But that's what I never understood. If it's something immediately zero sum being taken out of your base, how come they're not mindful of that?
Some of them get it. I think some of them are mindful of it, but I think others, view it along a longer term fiscal discipline mind and say, look, we have to do something around entitlements. And it's a lot easier to do this portion, slowing the growth of Medicaid in terms of dollar terms over a long period of time, than it is to take away Social Security or to limit Social Security or Medicare. But Medicaid, because it's a state and federal match program, there's a little more flexibility in what the federal government can do on it, and there's potentially more leeway there. So I think they're looking to make a trim around the edges, even though it would be huge impacts. And I think their hope and expectation is that if there are real impacts with people being thrown off the rolls, that it's not going to become apparent for a while, or that it's going to be overshadowed by other events. It's not going to be, one big announcement where suddenly 10 million people wake up and they don't have health care. That's not how Medicaid works, and not how it will work. There are going to be work requirements. There's going to be a very kind of phased in rollout of this. And the Republican hope is that if people rebel or react to it, it'll be far on the other side of the 2026 midterms. You have seen some members really concerned about this. And, getting the vote of Lisa Murkowski was really contingent on getting special treatment for Alaska, where such a rural state where they very much depend on that loose network of doctors and hospitals to continue to provide services. And that, a lot of people were critical of that extra work that she got there and other work that goes along the edges. So I don't think, Robin, they're unaware of it. I think some of them are, looking at this and saying this is an important entitlement reform, regardless of what the impact will be. Others are thinking the impact will be overblown. Others will say, look, these are people that should, if you're able-bodied, you should be pursuing work at least part-time. If you're not, elderly or disabled, you should have to show that you're putting in some effort, and that they view as a defensible position. And it may be that a lot of the Medicaid voters, people actually on Medicaid, are either Democratic voters or don't vote at all. And that's something we'll have to see.
What about the pie when you look at it and the projected CBO deficits coming out of this? And it's well past Donald Trump's time in office, assuming he doesn't, capture a third term or, I don't know, get some anti-aging thing. By the way, you have anti-aging cornered. I can say this to anybody watching it on YouTube. You are the preternaturally ageless Rick Klein, but I'll never stop bothering you about that.
I feel older by the news cycle almost every day, so I appreciate that.
But isn't it penny ante? Isn't it de minimis when you think about Medicaid and stuff at the margin versus the expansion of the ICE budget, the expansion of defense spending, the tax cuts, the enormous expansion of the tax cuts, tips? It's inside baseball. It's in the weeds, but it's actually just a sliver of savings. I'm thinking of it from a Doge perspective. Yeah. I mean, if you're going after big things, I mean, what does USAID save you versus, a massive expansion of some of these other entitlements?
Yeah, and look, I think we've long seen Republican candidates talk about the deficit and the debt, and then get into office and in control of the White House and Congress and not care about it anymore, and or care about it a lot less. And boosting defense spending. Go back to Ronald Reagan, and deficits were rising then, and all through George W. Bush, and certainly through the first Trump administration, even before COVID, even before the spending that COVID required, you saw an increase to the deficit and the debt. As the only balanced budget in our lifetimes came under Bill Clinton when the Republicans took over Congress.
Very short-lived at the turn of the century, right?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like a long time ago in a very distant memory, but yeah, I think Trump has talked about erasing the debt and the deficit, but we haven't seen real steps in that direction. We saw Doge come in, and we're not going to get a full accounting of what Doge actually saved the American taxpayer for a long time, and as well as whatever costs are, because some of those cuts will cost people health or even life potentially, depending on the services they're providing. It also efficiencies in government, in terms of being able to process government claims or get benefits. Those have harder to define things. But as we recall, Musk came in and said it'll be $2 trillion easy. Then it was down to $1 trillion. And any accounting you have now, it's in the tens of millions, if that. And we haven't seen anything commensurate on that side. Look, I've seen a lot of Republicans just say, forget the Congressional Budget Office. They're, those are partisan hacks, even though it's a nonpartisan group that they use to get actual, numbers behind these things. Otherwise, it's all spin. Their point is, look, we have to unleash prosperity. We can't let a new tax hike hit people because those original tax cuts were set to expire. And this is worth it for the price of doing business, and be all in on Trumponomics. Even with the tariffs or wherever we stand on tariffs on a given day to set this new structure, it is very much a trust in Trump and a trust in his instincts, a trust in his political instincts, a trust in his policy instincts that has been the overriding thing here. The through line, the only connective tissue you can find in this is Donald Trump, because this bill otherwise is a is a hodgepodge of a lot of different policy priorities. It isn't something that a conservative think tank would have just pushed together as a wish list. It's Donald Trump's wish list. It's his campaign promises. And whatever you call this bill, it's by its technical one big beautiful bill name, or the Democrats come a lot of labels out there for it. It is the bulk of his domestic policy and fiscal agenda. The parts of it that need legislative approval, they've crammed all of it into this bill, thinking, because this is how it works in politics right now, you kind of get that one big shot. You get one opportunity to pass something huge, and after that, you're a lame duck. You're on to the midterms. You lose some political capital. This is Donald Trump at his peak political capital, by all accounts, and that's how he's able to keep Republicans who have a lot of different viewpoints and represent different districts in different parts of the country and come from much different backgrounds. That's how you keep them together.
Full disclosure, I'm Roben Farzad. Our guest is Rick Klein. He is Washington bureau chief for ABC News, a friend of the show. He's been on a couple of times, and we had him here live back in 2018. We called that program Ace the Midterms. It was before the big blue wave in Trump 1. Rick was previously political director at ABC News. He was at the Boston Globe. I said in a past life he was at the Daily Princetonian, where we crossed paths and met 30 years ago. And I will get into some of your baseball prowess, because I imagine, you did cover the Congressional Softball Classic, right? Did you play-by-play that?
I almost got to do that, Robin. It's one of my life regrets. There, a couple of years ago, I was approached about doing it, and I actually started studying with my at the time a colleague that I worked on a podcast with from ESPN, Andy Katz. Ultimately, the decision was made that the game was maybe a little too boring to put on TV, so I didn't get that opportunity.
Would it be like ESPN 12? I don't know what is on the streaming tier.
I've listened to, I think Fox had the rights to broadcast it, and in their terrific Capitol Hill reporter Chad Program did some of the color. I was jealous of that assignment because I think that would have been fun. I've been a number of times. Little known fact: one of the best hitters that have come across the transom on the congressional baseball game was actually someone that we went to Princeton with, Jared Polis.
The governor of
Colorado.
Governor of
when
Colorado.
He was in Congress. I think he was a 300 hitter in the congressional baseball
game.
He was really good. Mostly they're not. The baseball isn't that good. The Democrats have been getting creamed the last couple of years. But before the Biden administration, they had a not so secret weapon in Cedric Richmond.
Oh yes,
then Congressman,
the ringer who was then he
was a college baseball player, and he could probably hit the 80s and have movement on the ball, and no one had a chance against him.
Wow.
I think they lost their one pitcher, and suddenly they're getting blown out, 20-3 or something.
I think it's broadly metaphorical for the Democrats' morass right now, which I do want to get into later on, and we'll get back to baseball and cross-platform Rick Klein at ABC Disney. But what about inflation? Right now, you're at a particular surreal place. I covered the markets and the Fed my entire life. There was always this delicate comedy between the White House and the Federal Reserve chiefs, whether or not that was the Federal Reserve, the central banker that they put forward. In this case, Jerome Powell was appointed by Donald Trump. And he's out there just actually pretty much saying your days are numbered. You might as well leave. You're irrelevant. You waited too long. There's no diplomacy. There's no nuance in it anymore. Meantime, they're on the verge of pushing through this hugely potentially stimulus tax bill. So from the monetary perspective, the Fed is worried about inflation, is not ready to cut rates. Inflation is still not contained. But from the tax and fiscal perspective, that could unleash and perpetuate an inflation. Are you hearing things? I know you don't cover markets, but this is clearly pocketbook issues. People wanted grocery prices to fall. They wanted car insurance prices, car prices. We're seeing more than vestigial inflation remain in the economy.
Yeah, and we're waiting for deals on tariffs that have long been promised. They're really trickling in, and I think the White House is going to have to be put in a position. The president has said he's not going to delay any more deadlines, but I think most people that are in the markets assume that he will, and that any deals that are cut come after that. I think one thing's, and I don't cover markets, Robin, you know it better than I do, but it feels to me like a lot of the markets have kind of baked in the noise, the friction between the Federal Reserve Chair and the president. That President Trump is going to say every once in a while, I might fire Jerome Powell, and he's...
No, it's gotten worse than that. He's already saying, I might put in your your replacement sooner. I mean,
Yeah.
it's again, I sound like an old man doing this, but it's really unprecedented. You didn't have that with Clinton and
No.
Greenspan. I mean, Greenspan was a leftover from the 1980s. You didn't have that with Bernanke initially. You didn't have that with Janet Yellen. You're just not supposed to go there, is my point. And we've talked about norms and line stepping and line crossing in the Charlie Murphy sense, but this really, and it's amazing to me, we just broke a record high on markets, and yet the dollar is at its worst start to a year since 1973. So it's a parlous time in markets and in trade. And there was this volatility since, what was it, Liberation Day, April 2nd? I forgot what it's called, Emancipation Day.
April 2nd, yeah.
And now people are throwing around Taco. Oh, don't yawn if he comes out and threatens Japan. Again, it blows the mind. And I know I'm sick of saying that it blows the mind, and you would have blocked that when you were my editor. But and yet here we are, record markets and a record tax plan to get pushed through.
Yeah, and look, I think there are so many, we throw around things like unprecedented a lot, but there are so many norms that have been changed, and attacks on judges from the president himself.
The F-bomb, the presidential F-bomb a few weeks ago.
Presidential F-bomb. My colleague Rachel Scott elicited one of those last week when talking about Netanyahu and the Israelis. Yeah. And look, I think the pardoning of all the January 6th defendants and the reporting this week that one of the people pardoned is now working in the Justice Department. I mean, those are things that you talk about, things that didn't happen before. No, those things did not happen before. I don't know, where the guardrails of accountability will really start. The courts are a piece of it, although I think the courts have ceded some territory there. Congress is a piece of this, but they've, I think, given, the Republicans have given this ground almost willingly because they recognize that the political force that is Donald Trump and the cohesion that he's brought and the energy that he's brought. I don't know that lasts forever. There's certainly been rumblings for a long time of, maybe this is too far. Maybe we're not comfortable with this. You had Mitch McConnell vote against a couple of cabinet nominees early on, didn't actually sink them. You saw Tom Tillis declare his own independence over the weekend, really a shocker for him to announce that he's against the bill, and then he's not running for re-election, and almost immediately thereafter. So you have a couple of senators who truly aren't, Republican senators truly aren't beholden to Trump. As we get closer to the midterms, I think there'll be others that have different views of how they need to get to declare that independence and maybe establish some things that he can't or shouldn't be doing. Until then, Trump's going to do what he does and trust his own instincts, and he does it well. He is an absolute master of that. He is around a lot, making a lot of news, making a lot of noise, talking to cameras quite regularly. And you look at this first 6 months of 2025, and they've got a lot to point to and say, look, a lot of the worst. The worst projections or the worst predictions about what tariffs would mean haven't come to pass. About what the Doge cuts would mean haven't come to pass. Even the national security and foreign policy, the Iran strike, not yet. In this early stage, has not sparked new versions of unrest. So I think it's going to take a long time to see how successful it is. But I feel like Trump himself will continue to act as he has for his time in public life. Until he's told that he can't. And that will be a political calculation as much as anything else. If or when Trump is viewed as more politically toxic among Republicans, I'd expect that some of them are going to view their role a little differently and want to reassert some authority.
Quickly, before we go to break, Rick, who is the leader of the Democratic Party right now ahead of the midterms next year? I asked the same question the evening in 2018, like who leads the party? It was very much in the wilderness after Hillary Clinton. There are some people, there were some newcomers who stepped forward in 2018. Sure. We recently had Abigail Spanberger on the live show. She has a great shot at winning governor in Virginia, but I don't know of a standard bearer, a speaker.
No, and there isn't one. And look, to be fair to the party out of power, it's very hard to do that. And, we would have said the same thing about the Democrats back in 2005, 2006. We would have said the same thing about the Republicans, in the era you talked about, right after, Mitt Romney lost in 2013. There wasn't anyone. Certainly no one thought it'd be Donald Trump just a few short years later. So I think, you look to congressional leadership, Schumer and Jeffries, who are, have their own hold on the party. It might be a little bit tenuous. That's difficult. The former presidents obviously have some degree of say and influence. Barack Obama seems to speak the loudest. When he speaks, it resonates the most. But even that's limited. I don't think Joe Biden has, a huge hold right now on where Democrats want to go. Kamala Harris, if she were to run for governor, I think would, immediately have a platform that puts her in leadership. But governors are where a lot of the action is going to be at. Governor Pritzker in Illinois. We mentioned Governor Polis in Colorado. Governor Whitmer for sure in Michigan. Governor Moore in Maryland. And the elections this year, if Abigail Spanberger is elected governor in this off year election, that will be seen as a potential a sign of how to win going forward. And Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey as well. You'll see some others emerge long before we get to New Hampshire or Iowa for the Democrats in 2028.
Full disclosure, please do stay with us. This show podcast to NPR, Spotify, Apple, all of the good podcatchers. And indeed, we are now on YouTube, which I'm trying to populate with all of our concert footage, our live show footage. I am not the most telegenic person in the world, but everybody says I have to be on YouTube. You can find us on Facebook, on LinkedIn. I bet you I still have a MySpace handle. Regardless, on social media, I'm at Blue Sky. You can find me on Instagram at Roben Farzad. Holler if you too would like us on your air. We send a shout out to our listeners on WVTF Radio IQ, Virginia's NPR news source. We are on KPPQ in Ventura, California. Let me see. We are in Asheville, North Carolina on WPVM. Again, my messages are always open if you'd like to carry us on your air. If you're just joining us, my guest is Rick Klein. He is Washington bureau chief for ABC News. He's formerly political director. He's a great friend of the show. He's prolific. You see him on linear. You see him online. I got to ask you, what happened in New York? How are you processing the mayoral primary with the Democrats? There's all this hand-wringing and fear and loathing. Oh, my goodness. A socialist who is openly kind of BDS, supporting, sanctioning Israel, and the Democratic Party rank and file. And of course, the largest Jewish population in the United States is concentrated in New York, outside of Israel. And then this is percolating up to Chuck Schumer and everybody in the party. You saw that I think Kirsten Gillibrand had some spat with him. Is this a potential, like a Star is Born? Are you hearing that?
Well, I think Democrats have to come to terms with what happened, and also knowing the caveats. This is New York City. This is a Democratic primary for mayor. It's a low turnout affair, early summer when a lot of people aren't paying attention, even though there was a ton of money out there and some big name candidates. And a lot of this, I think, will come down to, in analysis, say, a lot of people were voting against Andrew Cuomo. I mean, the Democrats came out with a candidate who was very flawed. He had resigned the governorship in scandal, very polarizing figure, hadn't really lived in New York City for some time with any regularity, and also ran a campaign that did not seem to reflect the urgency of the moment. Zohran Mamdani was everywhere, and he was saying yes to all sorts of media invitations, and he was showing up in lots of places. And I think 33 years old, very a lot of energy and urgency, and also running about cost of living. He certainly, his positions on Israel are well documented, but that's not what he was leading with. What he was leading with, things are too expensive in the city, and I want to make mass transit free, and I want to control rents. And I think for a lot of people in this country, probably a lot of them, I wouldn't say it's a New York thing, but a lot of people that voted for Trump just a year earlier, the same kind of messaging can resonate. I think over the last decade we have seen overlap between the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party and the Donald Trump wing of the Republican Party.
But the Republican Party so vilifies socialism really well. As you know, they've done it in South Florida with the Cuban exile community. They've done it in Southern California. They've done it in parts of New Jersey. It's like a rose by any other name is socialism. They call this guy they're saying that Stalin, you've seen some of the memes, some of the AI generated hallucinations about what New York would look like and hijabs. And so much of it is Islamophobic and anti, whatever you call it. If you were just to focus on the economic messaging, these are pretty unprecedented things. You would think about them in a time of depression, government-sponsored grocery chains, hard rent controls, a windfall tax on people making $1 million or more. As you and I know, there's a tremendous amount of money in New York that could combat that. And yet we saw in the primary that money doesn't necessarily move this needle.
I think Mamdani would gladly run against the billionaire class in New York because there are 8 million New Yorkers and I don't know, 200 or so billionaires. I mean, whatever the number is, I think you like his odds against that. You saw billionaires lining up on the other side, supporting Andrew Cuomo, even reluctantly. He'll take that fight. I think where it gets more complicated is, yes, on the fact that he calls himself a democratic socialist, what that really means. Is that something that New Yorkers writ large are comfortable with? It's going to be a very wide open general election campaign. You're going to have not just the Democrat and the Republican candidate, Curtis Sliwa, but Mayor Adams himself running as an independent, and potentially Andrew Cuomo running on an independent candidacy under another party line, all under the auspices of the wild ranked choice voting system that takes a while. So I don't know how it plays out. It is telling to me, Hakeem Jeffries, the House Democratic leader, was on our Sunday show last weekend. So, and he's a New Yorker, right after the primary victory. And John Carl asked him, now that he's won, are you endorsing him? And he said, no, not yet. And that's an astounding statement from
Chuck Schumer. How is Chuck Schumer? Chuck Schumer was very much APAC messaging goes through him. He's very open about it. How is he going to get the cloud cover to go out and say, yes, you should vote your conscience as a Democrat and elect Mamdani in this?
No,
and by
really
the way,
hard.
the other weird part is that the disgraced incumbent, Eric Adams, has an implicit pardon promise from Donald Trump. So if you're a Democrat, it's like enemy of my enemy of my enemy. I know I'm taking you into a wormhole here, but there are others trying to hit you up all week asking you about the national implications for the Democratic Party. And does it portend maybe a very leftward lurch?
Yeah, and maybe the Democrats come to the point where they need to embrace that or decide to embrace that. They're not there yet, and they're certainly still kind of thrashing around a bit about what the right messaging is. I think you're seeing that discomfort. The fact that Mamdani won a Democratic primary fair and square in a very Democratic city, and that you have so many prominent Democratic leaders who are not ready to go there. They're concerned about his positions, his economic positions, the DSA piece of it. They're also concerned about his positions on foreign policy and Israel in particular and what he has said. But the voters voted, and this is who they chose. And this is another one of those uneasy alliances. And you see, parties will shift to where the voters are. Otherwise, they will lose. That's how it works. So the Democrats will need to figure out how to square this. It's impossible to imagine them winning without the kind of voters that showed up for Mamdani or that supported Bernie Sanders or AOC, who supported Mamdani in this. Both of them supported this. You need that as part of the coalition, much as Republicans need Donald Trump voters. You can't do without. But we'll see it play out in a really complicated way, and in a way that is an imperfect kind of analog for the rest of the country. I hate to shock your urban listeners with this, but New York City is not America, and America is not New York City. It is a big, diverse place with a lot going on. But it's the largest city in the country. But most people are not New Yorkers, and most Democrats are not New York Democrats, and they have different priorities. So I don't want to overread and say Star is born here. I think people were saying that about Mayor Adams, that he was the future of the Democratic Party when he won. Almost anyone who's the mayor of New York becomes a national figure by virtue of leading the nation's largest city and having the big platform and the big media following. But you got to do something beyond that. And right now, Mamdani hasn't even won the general election yet.
Rick, how do you explain a red state iconoclast, an outlier like an Andy Bashir? What exactly is a Kentucky statewide Democrat? Because again, who's the guy who was felled in the mountains, the senator who
John
mauled
Tester,
his hand? Yeah, I mean, you just don't see them much
Sherrod
anymore.
Brown
Maybe
in Ohio, yeah.
Sherrod Brown in Ohio. I mean, Missouri used to have Claire McCaskill. I don't know. Louisiana had the royal family, the mayor, the Landrews, right?
Yeah.
Why is my impression that everything is so kind of color ward polarized that what is a person like that, or if you have to go back and study him, or the governor of North Carolina, what did they do so correctly that the National Party did not do?
Well, one interesting thing that you hint at in that question is that we're talking about governors who have been successful. Almost all the senators have not been successful, and there's a big difference. What a Governor Bashir or a Governor Cooper can do is a couple of things. One is, governor can be a lot more active than a senator, so you can be out there more, you can be doing things, and I think both of them are known for traveling the state quite extensively. The case of Governor Bashir in particular, it's a prominent political family, and that helps more than it hurts, especially in a state like Kentucky. You also get to be a little bit of the opposition party in a way that people appreciate if you are in a Republican-dominated state. Kentucky Republicans can mostly get what they want, and people do like the idea of a little bit of a check on that. There's also, historic party identification advantage that's persisted in Kentucky. It persisted in West Virginia for a really long time. West Virginia was a state that Michael Dukakis carried in 1988.
And stop with this fact for a second. In the hand-wringing after Gore lost the recount, can you imagine 25 years ago that people were saying, if only you had Clinton run for you more in West Virginia, you would have won? It seems inconceivable now. Like Senator Manchin was his own. He loved that. He loved being that person on Fox News. He loved being that irritant. He loved being that attention. But I can't imagine the Democratic Party reconstituting into what current West Virginia is. And yet somebody did it in Kentucky. And I wonder.
Look, Manchin did it as governor of West Virginia first. And he basically, as a senator, he acted as if he was the mayor or the governor of the place anyway. And frankly, he retired knowing that if he had run, it would have been a heck of a challenge in that environment last year to win. As it was, the Democrats really had no chance. And it was a former Democrat turned Republican, Jim Justice, who ended up taking the Manchin Senate seat. When I first got to Washington, it was Robert Byrd and Jay Rockefeller were the two West Virginia senators, Democrats both, and it still had, at the national level. But I think what's happened now is that just about every national campaign, anything involving a senator or a congressman, is national. And people think about these things differently, and they know that this is the vote that would empower. It makes the difference between Chuck Schumer and John Thune, makes the difference between Mike Johnson and Hakeem Jeffries, and that's an easy thing. For a long time, Nancy Pelosi was the
boogie woman.
So many campaign ads.
Yeah.
Harry Reid was used as a boogeyman in campaign ads.
Harry Reid.
But governors are different, and what's interesting, we'll see if it's a lot of talk about Cooper running now in that open Tillis seat in North Carolina. Does Bashir try to run in national office? Think about Pete Buttigieg, who's now moved to a different state and is still, I think, been a little hesitant to get involved in an attempt to run statewide for a Senate seat. I think running for mayor, running for governor, those are just inherently different. And right now, and this may not last either, but right now you have a situation where in a blue state, you could have a Larry Hogan, win as governor, but not as senator. In Maryland, he was not close in the Senate.
Or you very often had governors of Massachusetts being.
That's right.
Bill
I covered
Weld
a bunch
type.
of them. I covered Mitt Romney, and before that it was Jane Swift, and after that it was Charlie Baker. Massachusetts, which the time I was covering the legislature there, the state Senate was 34-6 Democrats or Republican, and yet there was a Republican governor that just got elected, and pretty resoundingly so. And I think people look for a little bit of a check in that way, but I think there's also a reason that Mitt Romney didn't run. He ran for Senate in Massachusetts and got creamed by Ted Kennedy. It was only when he moved back to Utah that he won a Senate seat. And even his politics have kind of been an interesting test case. You could track a lot in the goings on in his career. But yeah, it's an endangered species right now. A red state Democrat who's got that kind of persistence, and there aren't many true blue state Republicans out there. I mean, Susan Collins is talked about in that way, and she has survived some very tough re-election fights. But one of those two main congressional districts went for Trump both times, and there's a big strand of MAGA that courses through Maine politics that isn't necessarily
Vermont even. I mean, you go through Vermont. There's a kind of a they would get a "Don't Tread on Me" license plate if they were offered. But one other factoid. I know you're a great trivia person. I know you scour baseball cards and others. But I believe, and you'll have to fact check this. But if you go back to the first Obama administration, 3 out of 4 Dakota U.S. senators were Democrats, which again blows the mind.
And I think it was 4 out of 4, just a little before that. Tom Daschle losing to John Thune, of all people, was the one that ended that that Dakota domination. But yeah, it feels like a gazillion years ago that you could talk about West Virginia being competitive at the presidential level, or that a Democrat could win in either of the Dakotas, much less Missouri. Like you mentioned, Claire McCaskill. That seems like a really a tough reach. Then
or
again,
that Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas, right?
That's right. Then again, though, the fact that things have come all the way through in Georgia, the idea that there's two Democratic senators from the state of Georgia right now. Whether or not that lasts is pretty astounding. Same about Arizona. There's these push-pull. Look, you live in Virginia, and
it was ruby red for the longest time, but it would elect Democrat senators and governors every now and then. But it really switched in the time of Obama. It reverted back during Youngkin, but now it's become kind of purplish with leanings toward blue.
Yeah, and look, like I said earlier about how parties shift. I mean, the makeup in these states, they reach some kind of a mean. And when I started covering politics, I thought of Ohio and Florida as kind of those ultimate battleground states, right? They're pretty red right now, and it doesn't, there's no signs of them going back anytime soon. They're kind of seems to be on a one-way ticket. It seems like Texas has been on the verge of going purple or blue for a long time, and it's frustrated Democrats that it's taken as long. But it may just be a matter of time before it gets there. And yeah, I mean, Virginia, I would hesitate to call it a blue state even now. Not just Governor Youngkin. I think it's
well, they're very different states. I mean, you take Northern Virginia, which is its own metropolis and megalopolis, and you go down to Roanoke or you go to Bristol. I mean, it's a whole bunch of states cobbled into one.
I've thought about this a lot, Robin, too, because if you think about Pennsylvania, which right now is sort of the quintessential the biggest battleground out there, if you were just to move the border between Ohio and Pennsylvania over, I don't know, whatever it is, 30, 50 miles, and grab Pittsburgh, and if Pittsburgh is in Ohio instead of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania is a red state forever, and Ohio is now the battleground. So sometimes it's just sort of almost an accident of geography.
Oh yeah, they say the same thing about Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and Philadelphia.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, I mean and you could say that about Virginia. If Northern Virginia was its own, part of Maryland, or part of the 51st state of the District of Columbia, or its own thing, you'd have a totally different different political makeup. There's no doubt about that.
Rick Klein, Washington bureau chief of ABC News. In the 10 minutes or so we have left with you, sometimes I like to go freestyle, but I want to lob this in and get your thoughts on it. The gerontocracy. Someone had written about it in the Atlantic or earlier when we saw those pictures of the late Senator Dianne Feinstein and Mitch McConnell freezing. And obviously, a year ago, this is when this fateful debate with Joe Biden happened. And I'm thinking about the bench. I'm thinking about the various personalities out there and the contrast with someone like a Mamdani. People hold on to power. There isn't a bench system. Yes, I wore this Dodgers jersey not to troll you, but you always have to be mindful of your farm system, who you have coming up in the system, right? How you're going to replenish this. And you can hold on to power. And one quick last thing. I'm haunted by a New York Times piece about this fateful lunch Barack Obama had with Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the White House in 2013. And you couldn't offend her. She's this canonized Supreme Court civil rights figure. And hey, so I just want to get a feel, I got the votes. I don't know how they did it, but she stuck around. This is someone who had survived several cancers and then succumbs to cancer in the closing days of the Trump administration. Yeah. And there are consequences with that. There are entire consequences with this party. I'm thinking about the Supreme Court right now. Suppose he does get the big, beautiful bill passed. And then suppose he does become a lame duck, or he metabolizes the fact that he's not going to get much done next year. Does he then turn his sights to solidifying this hold on the supermajority in the Supreme Court?
Oh, I think Donald Trump would love to have a couple more Supreme Court picks. No question about that. I think the ones who are closest to retirement right now are conservatives. There's talk about Thomas, there's talk about Alito. And so that wouldn't change.
But you swap Thomas with a much younger.
Yeah, sure. That would solidify. It wouldn't change the 6-3 conservative majority. A sudden health issue or resignation from one of the three liberals would really upend things for generationally. As it is, though, the fact that he got those three picks in his first term, we had this weird symmetry for a couple of decades where Bill Clinton got 2 terms and 2 picks. And George W. Bush had 2 terms and 2 picks. And Barack Obama had 2 terms and 2 picks. And then suddenly Donald Trump gets 1 term and 3 picks.
But one of those picks were Barack Obama's.
That's
right. I mean, they changed the rules in the process of it. If you followed that logic, he would not have appointed Amy Coney Barrett when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed.
It's not purely about actuarial accidents here. You're right. I mean, there was political decisions that went into this, but the fact is, Jimmy Carter didn't get any in his term, it just happens like this, sometimes by historical accident, sometimes by a little bit more than that, in terms of the circumstance. But it's because Republicans had control of the Senate at that time that they were able to hold the seat open, the same way that they when Ginsburg passed, they were able to fill it very, very quickly, insanely quickly. The Scalia pick, they held open for 8 or 9 months, and they got a replacement for Ginsburg done in like 8 weeks. And it's because of where the political alignment was at the time. I have no doubt that Trump would love to be able to solidify. I don't know if if any of the justices would listen to that argument. We're talking about having the confirmation hearings and before the midterms because of the possibility the Democrats would take over. But I think, look, the issue of people sticking around too long is not a new one in American politics. The answer is voters ultimately, and that kind of pressure. If people are going to continue to vote for people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, or reward people, then that's what you get. And I'm also struck that age is so different for different people. I mean, Chuck Grassley's 91, and he, is still relatively vigorous, and he was there through all the Senate vote-a-rama. I had young producers on our team who needed the nap, and
yeah, but then Strom Thurmond practically had to be wheeled out to the floor of the Senate. He practically died there. Chief Justice Rehnquist had a feeding tube in his. Yeah. I mean, there's a level of absurdity. I have to tell you that no Fortune 500 company with a semi-independent board would stomach. I mean, you saw it happen with Sumner Redstone, but bad things happen, and I guess there isn't just a general HR policy or something. Both parties clearly are guilty of it.
You'd need a constitutional amendment. And Nikki Haley talked about this on the campaign trail of, talking about cognitive tests. And, I think, clearly people live a lot longer and can linger in worse circumstances than they did when the framers were thinking about these things. And the meaning of a lifetime appointment was different when people were, not expected to live past like 55 or 60 than, today when people regularly live into their 80s and 90s or beyond. But you need to have some real, structural reforms to force that, because there aren't a lot of members of Congress who like to give it up willingly. I mean, I thought about this when I was a young reporter on the Hill, seeing Ted Kennedy and thinking about, the legacy he had and all the things he accomplished, and why did he need to be, walking around the Senate. And I mentioned Senator Byrd from West Virginia. He was, quite infirm by the end. And
Fritz Hollings, there's no shortage of people.
Yeah,
much older.
It's bipartisan. It's and it's long running. People don't want to give it up. They like it. It can be an invigorating way. And I've talked to members of Congress who, their basic take on it is that there are people that get so used to it they feel like their life would end if they were to give it up willingly, and then literally their life does end. While they're still in office.
Try this for transitional device. I don't want to give you up willingly, Rick Klein, but in the 5 minutes we have left with you, I have to ask you about you. Thinking back, to 25 years ago, I personally been very reflective about it's 25 years in professional journalism for me. I moved to New York in June of 2000. It was a very, very different world. You talk about the budget surplus, the waning days. It was pre-9/11, pre-Gore recount, well before MAGA or anything else like that. There were norms in place. But I think it's safe to say, and we had this conversation in person recently, it is bleak for journalists. It is so bleak. It's never been this bleak. And you wonder if it's cyclical, if it's secular, if it's going to course correct. I got to ask you, because I know you get bombarded with emails seeking advice from young journalists. What, if anything, can you offer them right now? I think about you, for example. I think about someone like, who is the telestrator czar at MSNBC, now NBC
Kornacki.
News? Yeah, Kornacki. These are people, and I don't joke, you could be a great corporate citizen. Like the way you see Stephen A. Smith cameo on General Hospital. I mean, that's amazing. You're covering yourself in glory on ESPN. You're doing it on an ABC thing. Similarly, you can do that. But I'm also thinking about your life can't be entirely linear TV. It can't be Sunday mornings. You have to be a digital native. You have to be feeding that beast. A lot of your contemporaries, Chuck Todd, have seceded. They've gone on to kind of the Substacky world. What's in your mind right now, and what can you offer in the way of advice? I will say in that so many young graduates out of college right now are frustrated.
Sure. No, I get it. And it is, it's difficult. There's a lot of challenges, financial challenges, the news environment, and just the threats that journalists face, all of that. Look, I am invigorated by the fact that there's a lot of great journalism that's out there, and people want really good reporting, great content. And how they want it and how they want to consume it is changing all the time. I will say, for where I sit at ABC News, we do an extraordinary amount of work to go on television for World News Tonight with David Muir, to work for Good Morning America, for the Sunday show. We also are, we have a 24/7 digital channel, ABC News Live, that has become, a larger portion of what our audience looks like. Podcasting space, social media space. We're not just, the Peter Jennings era or the Dan Rather, Walter Cronkite era of television. That's there, and it's very important. And the ability to speak to that many Americans is a really powerful thing and a privilege for the team that contributes to World News Tonight. But it isn't everything that we do. And we are innovating, and we're trying new things. And we're delivering news in lots of different ways in people that want to consume it. And you can do that from a perch at a big news organization with a legacy brand like an ABC News or a New York Times, which is far more than just a print newspaper these days.
Yeah.
As you know, they're doing incredible work in visual storytelling, in podcasting, and in addition to breaking news stories. The through line is telling people, giving people information that they want in the way that they want it, and that hasn't changed since journalism existed. And radio was a disruptive technology when it came into existence. Television was a disruptive technology. The internet and social media and streaming, all of these are disruptive technologies. None of us are, just thinking, let's just continue to do things as the way we used to do it all the way. And one of the things I've loved about my now 18 years at ABC News, after working in print before that, is the innovation that goes on here and the thought that goes into this. And, we have some of the most talented young journalists that I've come across working in our newsrooms who are, helping power our reporting and putting things out in lots of different ways and lots of different forms. And if to a young journalist that really wants to do this, it was never going to be, glamorous work to begin with. It's don't get into this because you're going to be showered in money and glory. Get into it because you love it. And if you love it, then there's going to be, I'm confident, going to continue to be, market for it and good places for it to land. And there's a lot of great journalism going on. And, it can be an empowering time to be a young journalist, as sad as it might seem in the full landscape, because there's so many different ways for you to be able to tell your story. It's not just about whether you crack through as a correspondent on a World News Tonight. There's a gazillion different avenues that are open to you at big news organizations and at ones that are emerging all the time.
Have you been on The View yet?
I have.
And has Whoopi Goldberg squeezed your cheeks? And would you be okay with that going viral on Insta and TikTok?
I have been on The View. I've been on a couple of times, and I love that team. I love the producers there. I love the anchors there. And I love the conversations that we're able to have, in that opinion talk format. I was on The View the day after the election last November, and I was on just about zero sleep because I've been up all night doing the boards on ABC News and I'm through Good Morning America. And, just to be able to just unpack the election results a little bit and have a conversation about what happened. It's a great, proud platform. If you haven't seen the Barbara Walters documentary on Hulu yet,
I'm about to watch it. Yeah.
Of it. Oh, it's terrific. And she created and they've maintained, I think a great contribution to ABC and a great contribution to the media environment.
So yeah, I can't wait to see you on General Hospital. I think about some of the other properties, World News Tonight, right? You see, I grew up, I got to tell you, I say this to Sarah Just. She used to be there. She's now EP at NewsHour. I grew up in this country. I learned English watching Nightline. I think it was Frank Reynolds. Well, ABC News Tonight was Frank Reynolds, the late Frank Reynolds, and Ted Koppel on Nightline, which originally was covering the Iran hostage crisis. And my parents would let me stay up in 1979 and 1980 and watch this stuff. I mean, you shouldn't as a little kindergartner, as a preschooler, staying up at 11:30, but they were so glued to the TV, and there were parts Farsi and English and everything. And I have a sweet place in my heart for ABC News, and it's amazing to see your preternaturally young face on that big screen and small screen. And that's just a long-winded way of me saying thank you, Rick Klein. He is Washington Bureau Chief for ABC News. You're a friend of the show. You're always welcome to come on.
Thank you, Robin. And just if you want to give you a little goosebumps around this, I am sitting right now, I'm conducting this interview from Ted Koppel's old office in our Washington bureau.
Ted Koppel.
How cool
That's
is
all
that?
right.
How
You
cool
go look up a YouTube video of Ted Koppel duking it out with Ted Nugent
Oh,
at one of the nominating conventions. He's like, "What do you know what you're talking about?" And Ted Nugent's like, "What do you know, toupee breath?" Anyway, I digress. These are great stories from yesteryear, but thank you, sir. Always great to have you on.
Great to be with you, Robin.